Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So hello, Engagers. Once again, we are today with a very special repeat guest. It's one of the first persons I've met in this world of gamification and listened to as well, because it was through a talk. Because today we have Sylvester Arnab. Sylvester, are you prepared to engage?
Yes, I am.
Let's do this because Sylvester is a professor of game science who is the Applied Innovation Lead at the Disruptive Media Learning Lab of Coventry University and is an associate of the Center for Post-Digital Cultures and the co-founder of the award-winning GameChangers initiative. Sylvester, is there anything we're missing from that intro?
I think that's just perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic. And today we are here because, and you will find this a little bit funny given the circumstances we're at today, the fact that Sylvester is launching his new book, which talks about hybrid learning. And we'll be getting into that. But just one very quick clarification, please confirm this or disprove it as well. I am guessing that game science and hybrid learning spaces, which is the title of the book, was not inspired by the pandemic and its consequences. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. It is quite interesting that the book comes out at these crazy times where we are in, even though it was not the original inspiration of this, because never in my wildest imagination would I thought that we would be in this situation where we have to reimagine the way we teach and learn, the way we reconnect with colleagues, as well as, in terms of the social interaction that we have. But the discussions in the book is very much around how can we configure meaningful and authentic experiences, and how can we be more resilient in our practices regardless of the changing landscape of education as well as technology, culture, so on and so forth. So yeah, so it's great. It's strange, but it is great. Yeah.
It sounds like you racked up a month and a half and racked up a book and launched it, but it is not the case. However, I think the topic is also extremely timely in these days of, hybrid learning. I mean, my own experience as well in taking the classes from a physical to an online environment. We're already looking at how to do this during the fall. There are also already some changes that are happening to classrooms that would have been, the traditional in the sense of the physical space of the classroom would have been there. And now that is not the case anymore. Mm-hmm. So very timely discussion. We're going to be talking about today, all this discussion about what the book looks like, what it is all about, what are the concepts here, and what are some of the key lessons that we can take. And of course, we're going to be drawing some interesting conclusions for that. And the first thing is, the first term that comes, there, and I think is very interesting for the audience, is game science. What do you mean under this concept by game science?
Well, in this book, game science is defined as a field that investigates how playful and gameful experiences are designed and applied based on strategies and elements commonly used by game-based approaches, whether they are analog, digital, or hybrid, which also includes so many different other terms, which, I'm sure that most people are familiar with. For example, game-based learning, serious games, and gamification, and how these operations are underpinned by pedagogical and motivational theories and practices. As I said before, there are so many different terms which have been used to categorize such enabling tools, methodologies, and principles. In this book, I emphasize a more holistic approach in enabling anyone from any background to explore the characteristics and components of games and gameplay for their own practices.
Absolutely. That makes sense.
So essentially, game science focuses on the use of game principles in a strategic way in order to make a process or experience more accessible and more engaging, which is, of course, further discussed and explored throughout the book.
That makes sense. especially because that's what the book should be all about. And when you hear game science and then you think game design and you think gamification, would you say that there is sort of because I know there is the whole, and I don't usually get into these kinds of discussions, especially not publicly, because at least my perspective is, I do have an opinion on them, but my perspective is that most of the people who are listening or who could be listening to that discussion are not interested in the results, but rather on, as you were saying, the strategies and what can we do with these things. But would you say, and again, I'm going to rugged terrain here, how would you distinguish, game science, game design, gamification, game-based solutions, or whatever that looks like? Where does game science stand in this whole, theater of different strategies and terms as well?
Yeah. In chapter 3, I think, of the book is very much discussing about these differences. But one thing that I emphasize in that particular chapter is that regardless of what terms that we are using, it is essential for us to onboard those who are not familiar with game-based methodologies in not being confused with the debates or the different terms. Because essentially, we want to encourage people to get
That's great.
because we want to get everyone to be inspired by games, play, and gameplay, and how they can actually learn from this and how they can create their own experiences that would benefit those who are, that we should engage and perhaps for learning or perhaps for behavioral change, or perhaps they want to nurture positive habits, perhaps. But in that chapter, I did mention that it is also important for us to understand the history as well as the differences that some people might wish to talk about in terms of the differences between game-based learning, serious games, gamification, gameful designs, so on and so forth. And what I discussed in that particular chapter is where I group game-based learning and serious games as applied games. Because when you think about applied games, you can actually use existing commercially off-the-shelf games or any types of games out there and then repurpose it and remold it and turn it into an instrument that you can actually use to teach. Or you can create something that is bespoke, something that is created especially to teach certain subjects or to change certain behaviors, so on and so forth. So those are something that we can actually we can actually describe as an applied game. And it can either be game-based learning if it's for learning, and if it is essentially focusing more on the digital video games sort of technology. And the history of the definition is very much around the use of such games to be called serious games. But these days, it's like people are using these particular terms interchangeably. And of course, I described the history of the definition of gamification and how the word gamification has been used in so many different ways. And one key message that I would like to put out in terms of, this book and that specific chapter is, regardless of what the terms are, we should not create this barrier for anyone to try and explore it. And as I said in the beginning, it's like, how can we encourage people to be inspired by games and gameplay, and how they can actually use this to influence the way they create experiences in their practices. So yes.
Absolutely. In fact, this is precisely like, I love that message because it adds the rigorosity that you have, that you're bringing forth with, with your book, with your research, because I know this is something you've been doing for quite a long time. But it also accounts for the people. And again, we can even talk about, common friends that we have. Andrzej Marchewski, he is a strict, person in the sense of where the word stands and where it doesn't. But in the end, what he is actually doing out in the field, like many of us as well, is using all of these things. Like you could call it, some of the things that you do, you could call it game science. You could call it, some others are gamification. Some others might be series of games. Some others might be just, like fully fledged games or game-based learning. And it is a full-fledged toolbox. And in the end, for the person who is receiving this, they are receiving these tools and they understand that this is something that comes from games. So I love the way that you put this forth. And there is another term which I think is important and especially relevant nowadays. And I have to say that this is probably not exactly the same way you did, because we are sort of starting to use it right now in that way, but is the term of hybrid learning. You talk about hybrid learning in your book. It's part of the title. when you talk about hybrid learning, what do you mean by that? And I think that's also very important to sort of to cement where our conversation is going to be for the rest of the interview.
Excellent. When I talk about hybrid learning, I'm actually looking at the perspectives of learning at the speed of need across different spatial, contextual, and material modalities and the blending of these modalities. So hybrid learning proposes a more pragmatic and holistic approach for finding the right combination out of all modalities, regardless of what the prescribed binary of digital and physical in blended learning, for instance. So hybrid learning favors the overlapping and the cross-fertilization of often separate educational dimensions and modalities. For example, the cross-fertilization of pedagogical constructs, spatial modality, whether it's digital, physical, online, offline, formality, whether it is informal, formal, or non-formal, and the temporality of context, personal and social relationships, as well as identities. So hybrid perspectives is encouraging us to really think of what is the most meaningful configuration of experiences that we want to create, which is relevant for both education as well as game design. That goes back to the previous discussion we had in terms of the different terms that we have. We need to think of the best meaningful experiences that we want to create that will inform the design of learning that we want to create, as well as informing the design of games and game-like experiences that we want to create. So if we compare this to blended learning, hybrid learning is more strategic because it defines a series of varied processes and practices at the speed of need with a focus on the experience itself, where blended learning is very much more tactical, where the configuration of educational modalities is constrained most of the time by the binary of digital and physical didactics. So if we merge this with in terms of what game science can bring into this space, games and gameplay provide the insights into the mechanics, the dynamics, and the aesthetics of engagement and participation in experiences that will encourage, for example, learners or players to act, to make decisions, to reflect, which in a learning sense, it will nurture a lifelong learning practice that will guide them in their future inquiries. So the design practice of game for experiences combined with, for example, motivational theories, the pedagogical perspectives can definitely inform the way we configure meaningful and authentic learning experiences. And vice versa, hybrid perspectives can also in turn inform how we leverage game-based practices. For instance, as gaming technology evolves, we may get so excited and highly driven by the new opportunities to leverage our didactics and contents of the next trendy development. There is, of course, nothing wrong with this. I'm very, very excited with new technologies in gaming and different types of technologies that can enhance and supersize our experiences. However, there is a need for a hybrid approach for focusing on what experience that would best benefit the players, the learners, as well as educators. So both game science and hybrid learning, we can learn from both and be able to think about the experience that we want to create depending on who the target audience are. And I think it is a timely dialogue that we should have in terms of encouraging people to be more intentional in their design.
Absolutely. And in fact, this reminds me of the discussion that we had in the podcast with Richard Landers. One of the things that he was mentioning, and I think it was very interesting, is he was at that point, he might be still around those things. He was discussing the use of VR. And again, as you were mentioning, it's not the technology for the sake of technology, because one of the things that, for example, that we've had not trouble with, but we've struggled finding exactly where it is that it makes sense is, introducing VR seems like very exciting and very useful, but then you think about, okay, what are the affordances? And affordances is the things that you can do that you couldn't do without this technology. The affordances that you get from introducing VR, what are those affordances and how can those affordances be useful in that context? Because if they're not useful, then there's no reason to introduce that new technology. There is no reason to go blended or hybrid or whatever. That's I think a key point, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that, Sylvester, if we can, because I'd like to know, like, what is, again, of course, a bird eye view. Of course, I'm sure the details are in the book, but how do you utilize this? How do you view and say, well, the way of introducing this into real life would be having an approach like this one?
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned VR as well, because in the last chapter of the book, I talk about some of those trendy stuff that everyone is talking about, and especially in terms of the fourth industrial revolution and the evolution of education in terms of education 4.0. And education 4.0 is very much focusing on experiential learning. So that sort of really inspires some of the stuff that I'm talking about in the book, in terms of like what you're saying, in terms of how do we make sure that what we are doing is basically focusing on the intentional learning experiences that we wish to create, instead of being restricted or being entirely driven by technologies such as VR. I think one way to look at it, and one way that I'm looking at it in terms of the existing work that I'm looking at, is very much, as I said before, I will keep on saying this, it's like focus on the experience that we want to create. We need to have a storyboard of the experiences that we would wish our target audience to have, and intentionally think of what are the different types of activities, the different types of engagement that we would wish to create and design, and map it against existing theories. For example, if we want to create an educational experience, we need to ensure that every single activities that we create for that particular experience is mapped against the different types of learning contexts or learning constructs. For example, if you are looking at inquiry-based learning, what are the different aspects of that we can include as part of the design, and map it against activities. So the activities could be something that is more gameful and playful, because we learn about the engagement. How can we engage them in the different aspects of inquiry-based learning, for instance? And then we think about what are the technologies that will better enable these experiences to happen? Because it doesn't have to be one single solution. It can be a collection of activities enabled by different types of technologies that will provide a more contextualized, connected, and meaningful experiences. Because I would not sort of like start with the technology because I've got an equipment that will allow me to do holographic work doesn't mean that is something that is going to define what I do. But it has to be holistic and bottom up. And because it will work, because you can try different types of technology. For example, VR, if you think that, for example, we want to teach something to do with culture, and we are looking at artifacts that we can't actually get anywhere else. So perhaps, right, okay, I can create a game for this that people can interact with it, they will learn about the stories and whatnot, but they can't actually see it in a 3D sort of perspective. So it might not be as real. So it can be connected to another experiences that is enabled by VR, for example. So for instance, if they want to gain more knowledge about that particular artifact in a more realistic way, so they can use a VR part of the experience and be able to really engage and interact with it. But essentially, my main message is to think about the experience, break them down, map the activities against the pedagogical or the learning constructs, as well as the engagement that can be enabled through playful and gameful methods, and then think about the technology that will enable that.
And Sylvester, let me just make a quick pause here, because I love what you're saying, and the only thing I would like for you to sort of go into as well is to make sure, like, let's say there's one of the engagers who's listening right now and says, "Oh, that sounds amazing. I have this class on this and that. Like, how do I actually go about it? Like, yeah, I want to make sure that technology is right. I have like an open white canvas. Like, what do I do? How do I go about finding? I have, these objectives, these things. Yeah. I write down the objectives, the learning objectives. I think about, as you said, what is the experience I want my students to have? For example, as you're talking about cultural, I'm going to talk about business because I teach at a business school, so that's the typical. And I'm going to be teaching supply chain management very soon. So I have a supply chain management class. How do I, once I have the learning objectives, what do I do? Like, what could be the things that I do after that?
That's great that you asked that question, because one of the key things that I've observed and researched for the past few years is about the level of readiness of teachers in terms of the use of games or game-based pedagogy in terms of their teaching, because one of the key issues is how do we map it against the curriculum is one of the key issue, and how do we map it against the lesson plan.
Absolutely.
So in I think it was chapter 4 of the book, provide some examples of how you can actually do that in terms of, there are two key frameworks that I provide. One is something that is very simple in terms of the holistic considerations of how you should start storyboarding your lesson plan, meaning that, okay, you start with your learning objectives and how do you think the learning objectives should be achieved in terms of, for example, the learning objectives. One is to understand the value of open educational resources, for example. And how do I achieve and measure this? So the measure would be the student is going to demonstrate this particular skill by creating their own open educational resources, for example. So you sort of know what the activities that you think might be able to measure the particular learning objectives. And you would know what are the assessment and the measures. So that is the first layer that you need to think about. And the second layer is to break it down into something which is more realistic in terms of the context that you want to use, whether you want to use it in the classroom, whether you want to use it as part of the homework in an informal setting. So the context of use is important. So that would define what types, where and how those learning objectives are going to be met by the activities that the students will have to go through. And from there, you'll be able to think about how can I, in a way, quote unquote, gamify this or use the inspiration from games and play for these types of activities. So you'll be able to understand the mechanics of different types of games, perhaps that you have played with before. Because one of the things that we use in our workshops, as well as working with teachers in Asia, as well as in the UK, is to get them to think about existing games that they've played before, just to start with. What are the emotional connection that they had with that particular game? What are the activities and the mechanics, the rules of those games, and the aesthetics, meaning that the interaction between them and that particular game. So think about all those and break them down and map it against the activities that they wish to facilitate if they want the students to address the learning objectives. So one, you have done that particular mapping. So you have your design, the game design that you have by taking inspiration from different various games that you can actually think of. And then you can think of, okay, now is this going to be digital or is it going to be analog or is it going to be a hybrid? Are there any existing open source or free softwares that I can use to create the game? There are so many different types of softwares out there that we can actually use. For example, the RPG Maker and all sorts of different other platforms that can be used if you want to create a digital game. Or you might decide, I want to create a board game that is going to help me to teach physics or to teach business or to teach all sorts of different subjects within that particular classroom setting. So this is the process that our lecturers are going through. So they think about their learning context. They think about how can they make it playful. So they will look at existing games. And then they will think about the technology and map it and then iteratively test them out. And for example, one of the games which have been created by 2 lecturers and 2 students, which is called Imparab, is a game that is used to teach Italian in a location-based setting. So they decided on that types of technology that they want to use. And in the end, they used a free software which was provided by the MIT. So they created those games themselves and used it in Coventry city center to teach
Italian, right?
Yeah. So I think the thing is you need to make sure that everything is broken down and going back to the storyboarding of experiences that I mentioned before and map it against the lesson plan that you wish to address. And some of the examples in the book, there are different frameworks that I mentioned in the book, especially in chapter 4, in terms of something which is more rigorous. Once you understand how do you create games for your classroom, then you want to make it more rigorous in terms of what is the scientific evidence behind that. So you can look at another framework that is providing, how do you call it, more rigorous methodology for thinking about the mapping of the learning itself and the game components. and you map it against the motivational aspects. So you can do your assessment of your game to ensure which part of the game is actually achieving what part of learning. Because that is one thing that is missing in the research in terms of the mapping of what part of the game, why and how are they effective in supporting learning. So more work is needed in that particular area. But the book provides the framework that will allow you to really think about the rigor of the games that you are going to create or gamified lessons that you are going to create for your classroom.
Absolutely. That is beautiful and super, super important. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. Sylvester, I think that, what we've been talking about is very, very deep and very interesting. So the first thing, we're sort of arriving at a certain point, and I want to make sure that before the end, one, you let us know where we can find that book before we end, just to let it in here, because I'm thinking that many of the engagers are already piqued in their curiosity. And where can we find maybe the book, maybe more information? How do people get to know more about this?
The book is available on the publisher's website, which is Routledge, and it is also available on almost all the usual outlets. For example, Amazon. It is also available on Waterstones, Barnes and Noble, all the typical bookstores that you have. So you can just search for the book, and then it will provide you with all different links. Or you can go on my blog. My blog address is sylvesterarnab.com, and I am providing a series of blog posts to provide more insights into the premise of the book, the inspirations for the book, and in each of the blog posts I provide the link for where you can actually access this particular book, and I hope that it will be useful.
Absolutely, I'm sure it will be. And where, because there's all these things, and some people will say, well, like, where does it even come from? Like, what was your inspiration for writing a book like this book?
It is interesting because I've researched and investigated game-based learning. How do we apply it? How do we use games and gameplay to support, complement, and also enhance educational experiences since 2009? So that is a long time ago. I was still a child then, but anyway, through various initiatives and research projects. And the main focus of what I've researched through this particular projects is on the experience that we wish to create and facilitate, as I mentioned before, the experiences that would engage and empower learners in education and also nurture creative and co-creative practices. So the question is very much around how should games and gameplay be utilized as inspirations for informing the design and the enabling of such experiences, and how do we configure experiences that will be authentic and meaningful. So, as I said before, the focus on hybridity in education is definitely timely, and the inspirations came from years of exploring empathic and experiential game-based learning design practices, as well as education in general, because I've worked with different stakeholders, different groups in the UK as well as abroad, from the level of primary schools up to higher education, further education, and professional development. So I have observed the different types of challenges that educators are facing. So these inspirations from engaging with teachers themselves and educators, as well as the game-based learning and serious games and gamification community, that has inspired the book in terms of, okay, let's talk about how do we configure meaningful experiences? How can we learn from games and play? And how can we deconstruct learning in such a way that we would think about the learners themselves? What do we want them to go through in the process, so that we will provide something that is useful and that is something that is fit for purpose, and something that is not entirely driven by the trendy, new, shiny things. It's something that I would think that would be relevant, for so many years, because technology would change, the educational landscape would change, but essentially we need to be very resilient in our practices, and we need to encourage learners to be resilient as well. And we can definitely learn from games and gameplay, the inspirations that can help us to develop engaging, active experiences that facilitate meaningful application, reflection, and consolidation of knowledge, competencies, and capabilities, which I find interesting. And, the use of games and gameplay in education also extends to the use of game design and game making process as an educational practice. Because one of the key things that I mentioned, and not only that, we need to encourage people to configure meaningful experiences, we need to promote the sense of ownership of the process. So we have used a lot of different methods in encouraging teachers and educators to create and co-create their own game-based learning resources or gamified lessons. And they've learned a lot from this. Of course, the quality of the games or gamified lesson plans might not be as good as most of the games which are created by professionals. However, they are learning through the process, meaning that we onboard them in the process, they will practice it, and towards the end, they will master that particular process in creating their own resources, so it gets better each time. And the fact that they can implement it in their own classroom has really inspired them further and empowered them as well. So all this is discussed in the book in terms of the different types of engagement that we need, not just encouraging people to use games and gamified methodologies for teaching and learning, but to encourage them to co-create it as well.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. And one of the reasons that there's sort of two things that happened there. And one of the reasons I asked this is because, when we met back in, I believe the first time I saw your talk was in Gamification World Congress here in Madrid, which was probably somewhere around 2016, I'm guessing. Wow. That was the last one. And there you were already talking about this whole hybrid learning. So that was the first thing that came to my mind when I said that. Wow. And again, I sort of teased that question because I knew that this is something that has been a long time coming from you, because I know you've been doing research around these things and talking about this, through the beaconing project that you did before, all these things that have been going on. And the other thing is, I think, at the start we said that this was not inspired by the pandemic, but assuming that this pandemic was inevitable and that it was going to happen, I do think that even the pandemic is kind of timely right now, because imagine had this happened, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, how would, we have continued education and many other things. I don't think that the tools were still available. There was not a level of maturity. I don't know if you've observed something similar, and this is probably the last that we're going to get into, but have you also observed the level of maturity, not only of, the understanding, because of course it's important to have that understanding, but the general maturity of both technology, society, it's reaching that point where this is actually most relevant now?
It is highly relevant. And the fact that pre-pandemic, we are bombarded with so many different types of technologies, some of which have got rigor in terms of there are a lot of research behind them, but some of them are just softwares or platforms which have been created to solve certain problems, for example, communication, how can we do remote learning, so on and so forth. And people don't actually pay a lot of attention. People just use them based on functionality. However, during the pandemic, it seems that everyone that I've talked to, especially when we are discussing the content of the book and in terms of the hybrid perspectives of how can we configure experiences, everyone is saying that they realize that now they can actually have a better understanding of why they want to use digital platforms. And not only that, they are looking at digital platforms as a collection of enabling tools, not the main enabler of learning. So they can use it in however they want. But they've learned that they have to think about, okay, what do I want my learners to experience? What do I want my learners to learn? Right, okay, if they need to do some hands-on stuff, how can I do it? So what types of platform that can help me to do that? Or can I just provide something that is more gamified? For example, I've spoken to someone who basically created sort of like a mission and quest sort of approach to their teaching and learning. And they don't actually focus on the platform itself. They use the platform, for example, Microsoft Teams or Zoom, just for the interaction that they have face to face. But the context of the learning is very much meta. It's like a meta game. So they will provide, the person will give out missions for the students to go out and conduct and do their creative inquiry. And they will come back to the Zoom meeting as a mission hub. So meaning that they are all agents which have been sent out into the world and try to find out information that is going to be pieced together in the discussions. So if you focus on the experience, it will really change the way you teach and the way you learn and the meaningful experiences that you have. But of course, the isolation part is not as useful, where I can say that some people are more resilient in terms of being isolated from the colleagues and being isolated from their friends and
Absolutely.
families, but some people are not. So not only in terms of the learning, the educational aspect itself, the mental health issues is one of the key things that is coming up a lot in the discussion that I have. So how do we learn from this experience in terms of gameful and playful, and learning, how do we engage someone who is in this situation? How can we help them to give them a program of activities that might be able to help them in coping with being on their own in, say, for example, a small apartment somewhere in the middle of the city where you can't actually go anywhere. So that's quite useful. And there has been a lot of research with perhaps assertions or some simple case studies which have been done about how playing games have really helped people to cope with lockdown, because they are able to contextually explore a fantasy world where they can feel like they are, they have the freedom and the sense of autonomy and ownership to go anywhere they want and to do whatever they want within that particular game scenario. I think that is a good thing. It's giving us, those who are creating games and designing games, we want to think about, okay, how do we use this as a platform that is to encourage people to perhaps focus on the well-being as well, focus on not just the learning, but focus on a full spectrum of different types of capabilities that we wish our learners to have. And resilience is one of the key things that we are looking at the moment. And we have projects that we are running in Southeast Asia where we are looking at social resilience, and colleagues and policymakers and funders and Department of Education are talking about, okay, how can we address the pandemic issue, and how can we be better prepared in the future? How can we use the inspirations from gameful techniques and playful techniques in designing experience? So that is something that is positive,
very relevant, and very, very timely as well. So thank you very much for all of this. If you want to listen to the the first interview that we had, it's episode 5. So it was pretty long while ago. That was very exciting. I'm sure you'll hear to a very polished Sylvester and a very raw Rob here experiencing the podcasting for not the first time, but in this format and this whole thing, it's probably going to be a lot more raw, but I'm sure you can have fun with it, right?
I'm sure.
It'll be a good experience if you haven't heard that episode. Anyways, yeah.
I was about to say that is like, for me, that's like level 1 of my game, and then now I'm on level, I don't know what level it is, but I think I have definitely matured since then.
I'm sure we both have, for sure. So thanks again, Sylvester, for sharing this, for writing your book, because actually we know this is a very creative and very hardworking endeavor in general. And in some occasions it is well paid. Most of the times it is not something that pays off as other endeavors with a similar level of dedication would. But thank you very much for dedicating that time, for putting this book out there, for putting forth all of that research that you've done. I think it's a very exciting thing to do. And of course, definitely thank you for being with us today. I mean, we've invested some time talking about this. I think there is still a lot to be talked about. There is a lot more discussed in your book. So I would invite all the engagers to go to sylvesterarnab.com, probably type book in the in the search bar, and you'll definitely bump into Sylvester's current book. However, we're running out of time. And before we just move on to the next thing that all the engagers are going to do now, I'd like to know where we can find more about you, about Sylvester, whether it's on social media. We already know about sylvesterarnab.com. Is there anywhere else that we can find you?
You can follow me on Twitter. So it's at @sarnab75. Or you can also, if you search my name on Google, and I think the first link is going to appear is from the university. So that is like a more in-depth description of who I am. But and the projects that I'm doing, as well as the publications and whatnot. So you can have a look.
Fantastic. Thank you very much once again, Sylvester. However, for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you here, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Sylvester. Are you using Instagram? I am, posting. I'm more and more regular every now and then, and I would love to connect with you there. Just like on Twitter, you can find me as Rob Alvarez B. And before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know some of the secrets of Disney Imagineers? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.